I'm Joshua Mitchell from Affordability. We are a protest organization focused on creating more housing in Central. We really support density that is eco-focused on us and have walkable, bikeable, livable neighborhoods for everybody.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'll start with a quick introduction. I'm Justin Safe. I live in East Cambridge. I've got 2 daughters in Cambridge Public Schools at Amigos and Cambridgeport, very close to here. And I'm one of the co-chairs of Better Cambridge, along with Becca Schofield. Better Cambridge is an all-volunteer nonprofit advocating for housing affordability in Cambridge. We're committed to creating a more affordable, sustainable, and vibrant Cambridge. We believe that increasing housing, creating affordable housing, and enhancing tenant protections are critical to ensuring more people can live here and stay here. Our goal is to increase access to the opportunities the city provides, regardless of background or income. Through education and advocacy, we seek to impact the public conversation, include underrepresented groups, and encourage thoughtful planning and policy. We also work with Abundant Housing Massachusetts, as does Somerville YIMBY, to advocate for housing at the state level. We supported Governor Maura Healey's Affordable Homes Act that will bring thousands of new homes to Massachusetts. ABC joined an amicus brief that helped draft in support of Attorney General Andrea Campbell in the MBTA Communities Act litigation with Milton, and ABC will continue to work with Abundant Housing to hopefully pass their YIMBY Act bill in the current legislative term. Some of ABC's local highlights include ending exclusionary zoning in this past term, which was a ban on multifamily housing in certain Cambridge neighborhoods. Exclusionary zoning, as you may know, has a long and unsavory history associated with discrimination by class and by race. And frankly, it was a stain on our city's history that I'm very proud of ABC's role in bringing to a long overdue end. I got involved with ABC back when a lot of my friends couldn't find anywhere they could afford to live and ended up having to leave Cambridge. I know a lot of Cambridge residents of all ages and tenures frankly have had similar experiences, and that is what's led to a lot of folks joining Better Cambridge. My 9-year-old daughter has already had close friends and classmates move because their families couldn't afford to live in Cambridge. But she also has friends who have been able to stay because their family was lucky enough to get a housing voucher off the wait list or to find a permanently affordable home. And ABC also helped pass the 100% affordable housing overlay, as well as last term's amendments to the overlay. And we are nearing 1,000 affordable homes, environmentally friendly homes, that are coming to Cambridge so far, thanks to those efforts. We've also worked to more than double funding to the Affordable Housing Trust, resulting in the investment of more than $100 million in affordable housing in Cambridge. And we continue to push for more homes, more tenant protections, and more funds for affordable housing. Now let's introduce today's panel. First off, we have Jake Gilbert, far end there. And Jake is a geospatial analyst with the National Zoning Atlas. He's a graduate of Middlebury College and previously worked as a geospatial analyst intern with the Vermont Zoning Atlas. At the National Zoning Atlas, he has worked on digitization, analysis, and cartography for Greater Boston. Next to Jake is John Franca. John is a professor of law at Suffolk University. His scholarship focuses on land use regulation, affordable housing policy, property theory, and law and religion. His current research projects include an examination of the legal and intellectual history of single-family zoning districts, land use, and other regulatory barriers to the development of new forms of housing. John and Jake tonight will discuss how the National Zoning Atlas has digitized, demystified, and democratized information about zoning conditions in more than 33,000 jurisdictions in the United States. Next we have Vincent Millay. Vincent is a PhD candidate in the MIT Department of Economics. His research explores why cities struggle to adapt their built environments as economic conditions shift, and why certain urban spaces become stuck in outdated patterns of development, focusing on New York City. Finally, Amy Dane is a senior fellow at Boston Indicators. Amy is known for translating complex zoning issues into accessible insights for policymakers, advocates, and the public. Her in-depth reports, including Exclusionary by Design and the State of Zoning for Multifamily Housing, have reached wide audiences. Most recently, she has conducted extensive analysis of the implementation of multifamily zoning under the MBTA Communities Act, and she's going to share that with us tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Jake first to get us started.
Good evening, my name is Jake. I'm an analyst for the National Zoning Atlas, and we'll go over pretty quickly just introducing the Atlas, and then I'll hand it over to John to go over the MBTA updates and research we've done. So first I'll go over what is the National Zoning Atlas, how to use it. We'll go over just an example with the Cambridge multifamily zoning reform, and then go over MBTA. So the National Zoning Atlas is an online interactive map that illuminates key information about the country's 30,000 zoning codes. So if you want to follow along, you can also go on zoningatlas.org/atlas. And we have a national scope. We've worked on 25 states so far. And here are the states that we have finished and continue to update. California, North Carolina, and Utah are almost done. So we have published over 8,000 jurisdictions so far, and jurisdiction is basically any unique town, city, or county that has its own zoning code. And our analysts have read through almost 1 million pages of zoning code, and we have published over 91,000 separate zoning districts. So using the NTA, when you log on or go into the public map, you see the national map. You can see where the purple is zone land, the green is protected land, white is land we haven't analyzed yet, and the gray is unzoned. And if we zoom into Massachusetts, the purple breaks down, and the darker purple is mixed with residential zoning districts, and the light purple is primarily residential, and then the tan or salmon color is mostly commercial or industrial uses. And you can see the white circles there, that those are transit stops, which comes in handy if you're looking at the MBTA communities as well. So you can filter it, so you can see where you can build single-family homes by right. And in Massachusetts, that's around 96% of zone land, and multifamily housing is around 4% of zone land. So as an example, I'll compare Somerville and Cambridge. So if we compare single-family zone land, in Somerville, that's around 68%, and in Cambridge, it's around 90%. And if you look at the bottom right of both of these screenshots, you can see where the filtering shows you a breakdown of the zone acreage and the percentage. And if we go to multifamily zoning by right, Somerville goes down to around 16%, but as you know, many people know that Cambridge had their multifamily zoning reform this year, so it's around the same 90% zoned acreage. And I will hand it over to John to go over details. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to take over here. You know, one of the benefits of the Atlas as we see it and try to kind of push it out there for people in the communities to use is the ways in which some of this data, which might be known, or at least not surprising, is made easy to see and to visualize the exact impact of zoning on our communities. So this goes a little bit more into what Jake just mentioned. which is looking at housing units allowed. Of course, in Somerville, legalization of triple deckers explains this kind of drop off when you get to 4+ families. Whereas here in Cambridge, the zoning largely allows 4+ families in most of the city. So we also wanted to share a little bit about kind of preliminary findings related to MBTA communities. And I should mention, we're actually working on a report. We launched the Atlas a few months ago, but we're working on a report that's going to summarize some high-level findings with a couple of different themes based on kind of interesting things we found about zoning in the Commonwealth. But we'll also talk a little bit more in that report about the MBTA Communities Act and its implementation. So, of the 98 towns whose zonings have been approved and logged, at least as of the time we last updated things, we saw the largest increase in Malden and Arlington, a 4% increase, making multifamily housing allowed as of right. We saw a significant number of towns, however, where the increase was an absolute percentage of less than 1%. So small increases because many of those towns already allowed sufficient amount of multifamily housing as of right. And then some towns seem very low, 9 out of 69, blocking just a 0% change in acreage. And to show how this has been visualized on the Atlas, actually before I get to that, let me just say one other thing. So in terms of multifamily allowance, the MBTA communities, we found 6.9% of land in those communities, across all of them, is zoned multifamily, which compares to 3.5% of the land statewide in all other communities. However, the increase since MBTA communities is not that significant. 6.2% of the land in the communities we looked at had been zoned for multifamily prior to those towns adopting plans pursuant to the communities law. Now that number's gone up just to 6.9%. To show a visualization of this, the Atlas allows us to kind of look at things kind of before and after to see where this implementation has affected zoning on the ground. And this shows Malden, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the town which, as a percentage, has seen the largest increase in zone acreage. And this reveals where that new rezoned areas for multifamily housing can be found. So more generally, the zoning atlas, we see it as a tool for individuals who are advocating for more housing in their communities, state and local levels, to enlist this data, to visualize the existing zoning in their communities. There's also a zoning snapshot tool, which allows you to, at the level of an individual community, or at the level of a county, to see the key attributes of zoning for that level of geography. We also hope that it's going to more broadly have impacts beyond just housing as we think about other pressing issues that land use policy and regulation affects, sprawl, climate change. So we're going to finish up there. We want to just thank the folks who helped support this project, and then we'll pass it off.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Vincent Goulet. I'm a PhD student at MIT at the Department of Economics. And over the past couple of years, I've been spending a lot of time working on zoning and trying to understand how it affects construction and prices, focusing mainly on New York City. And tonight, I'm very happy to be here to present a couple of takeaways from this research. My starting point in my PhD was the fact that many of the world's largest cities, including all these large cities in the US, are really failing to make space for their new residents. And as a consequence, home prices there have been growing much faster than incomes. This is obviously a huge burden on household budgets, but it's also holding back broader economic growth because these large cities like New York or Boston or San Francisco are really the most productive places in the United States. And zoning is often denounced as a culprit for these trends. So most of you already know what zoning is. Just to restate this, zoning is a set of local regulations that restrict the characteristics of new buildings. So the most well-known of them are density regulations, for instance, mandates for single-family homes or height limits. But zoning also restricts what uses of land are acceptable. So some areas are zoned to be fully residential, others mandate commercial uses. But zoning is not the only thing that prevents places like New York or Boston to grow. These places are now very dense. And in urban cores, the vacant land is now very scarce. One consequence of this is that change in these cities must come from redevelopment, the process of demolishing old buildings to replace them with new structures. Incidentally, this is increasingly how cities grow. Around the world, cities are less and less sprawling outwards. Instead, they're building upwards. But this is much more expensive than greenfield development because you have to demolish existing structures. So my research has been focusing on what would be the effects of relaxing zoning given that there are these other technological constraints to construction. I've done so in the context of New York, where I have very detailed data that allowed me to track every single parcel of land in the city, to track all buildings, there are about 1 million of them in New York, and look at which parcels were developed at different points in time. And it's a context in which you can also follow prices over time quite deeply. Most of my work has been to build a model of the supply and demand of floor space in New York. So this is a typical economics model where on the supply side, we're trying to understand the behavior of developers. These are the people providing new floor space. We're going to make their decisions as a function of the existing built environment, prices, and regulation. And on the demand side, you're trying to understand how households and firms consume floor space, and as a consequence, how increasing the supply of housing is going to affect prices. Today, I'm not going to go to the technical aspects of this work, but I'm going to highlight a couple of facts and findings that come out of this research. One institutional detail that I'll mention is that zoning in New York mainly uses one instrument, which are limits on the floor area ratio, also known as FAR. This is the amount of floor space in a parcel divided by the surface of underlying land. So these two buildings, for instance, both have an FAR of 2. New York adopted its current zoning ordinance in the 60s. At the time, urban planners really thought that New York had reached its maximum size, and they didn't think that zoning was going to be particularly distorting development. They just wanted to orient future development in a way they viewed as beneficial for the city. They wanted at the time to promote towers in the park, so large apartment buildings that are surrounded by parks or parking lots. And they also wanted to separate residential spaces from commercial lots. One thing that's very striking is that zoning is extremely persistent over time. So if you take New York's current zoning map and you overlay it with the zoning map of the 1960s, they almost fully align. There has been relatively little change despite a huge increase in the prices of floor space in New York City. Something that's fortunate is that several areas of New York have been upzoned in the past decades. The zoning regulations there have been substantially relaxed. And so what I'm going to think about is what is the effects of these policy changes that are similar to the ones that Cambridge has witnessed very recently. One thing that is extremely striking in the data is that redevelopment is associated with densification. New buildings in New York are almost always larger than the ones they replace. And on average are going to be much larger. The typical new building in New York is 3 times larger than the old building that was demolished to make way for it. In other terms, it's not economically feasible typically to demolish a 3-story building to build a 4-story building. You demolish a 3-story building to build a 10-story building. And this is natural. Redevelopment, tearing down old buildings, is associated with very large costs that developers have to overcome. One consistent finding is that redevelopment is only going to happen when upward growth is allowed. Buildings in New York that are at or above the zoning limit have basically a zero probability of being redeveloped. It's only when developers have an opportunity to add more floor space that they actually come. Then, to understand more specifically the effects of zoning, one thing that we can do is look at these policy changes that happened over the past decades. You can compare areas of New York that have been upzoned at different points in time to understand the effect of upzoning on construction. The typical upzoning that happened in New York over the past decades increased the allowed FAR by 1 point. What's interesting is that it takes really a lot of time for the cities to adjust to that change. After a decade, I find that only 10% of the newly allowed floor space has actually been built. So we shouldn't expect that as soon as you allow the construction of more housing, that housing is going to materialize. It's really, or immediate, it's really going to take some time for that change to happen. What's also interesting is that the effects of upzoning are not going to be the same everywhere. I find that upzoning leads to more construction, but only in the places where developers are going to have real incentive to come in and where they're going to be able to overcome the large cost of tearing buildings down. So in New York, this meant that upzonings did lead to more construction in areas that were expensive, like Western Brooklyn or Manhattan. But if you upzone places where resources prices are very low, then you're not going to see that much more construction. A second thing is that when you upzone, not all buildings are going to be redeveloped to lead to more housing. The areas that will witness construction are those where density was initially quite low. Because here it's much easier to tear down the initial building to build something. Another reason for which this process of redevelopment is important is because it's going to reallocate land to its most profitable use. On this map, I'm showing you the difference between the price of a square foot of residential floor space and the price of a square foot of commercial floor space in different areas of New York. So basically, in the center of New York, residential floor space is about 30% more expensive than commercial floor space. And in the periphery, commercial floor space is more expensive than residential floor space. This is due to historical forces. When New York was built in the first part of the 20th century, it was a manufacturing city, and all commercial activity was centered in the core of the city, while people lived in more attractive suburban neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx. But then New York changed a lot. New York is no longer a manufacturing city. Now a lot of people want to live in Manhattan, while businesses have tended to move to the periphery. And these changes in preferences manifest in price. Developers react to these price changes by building what people desire. So over the past decades in New York, the center of the city has been shifting towards being more more residential, while the periphery has become more commercial. These changes are valuable, but they are restricted by zoning, because the center of New York is mostly zoned for commercial purposes, while the periphery is almost exclusively zoned residential. Another thing that I wanted to tell you about is the effect of construction on prices. So, to understand whether building more housing actually leads to lower rents, you can look at neighborhoods that witness more construction and look at how the rents of existing buildings evolve. And I find that when you have large construction events, this does lower rents, although it takes a bit of time. Well, this might run counter to the intuition that some people have, because oftentimes you see neighborhoods that witness a lot of construction, and at the same time have rents that are growing fast. This is a confusion of correlation and causation. What's happening is that when areas become more desirable and prices are increasing there quite fast, developers do come in to build more. But it's not because there's development that prices increase, the reverse is happening. And in economics, a lot of our work is to separate this correlation from causation. The idea here is that you can't compare neighborhoods that see a lot of construction to other areas of the city. These different types of neighborhoods are fundamentally on different trends. To isolate the effect of construction, you really need to focus on neighborhoods that were initially on the same trend, but some received construction and others did not. What I'm doing here is comparing areas that received construction earlier versus later. Both of these types of neighborhood have growing rents, but then the areas that receive construction earlier have rents that rise less fast. And this allows us to understand the effects of new construction on prices. Based on all this data and results, I'm estimating a model of the city, and I'm able to simulate how the city would evolve in the coming decades under different zoning scenarios. So I first consider a status quo scenario in which zoning regulations stay at their current level. I then consider a realistic but quite ambitious upzoning of New York. And finally, I move to an extreme in which I completely remove zoning. So what happens when these changes take place? I find that under current zoning, New York would continue to grow slowly. Its amount of floor space would increase by 30% by 2060. And then a massive upzoning of New York would increase construction quite a bit. But it's not because you allow a bunch of new housing that this housing is going to be built immediately. I find that only about 20% of the new floor space that is allowed is actually built in the subsequent 4 decades. These processes are really slow. When you completely remove zoning, you have quite more construction. But even in this extreme scenario, I find that residential rents don't decrease that much. They only go down by 18%. And this is because of migration. When you build more in New York, this extra housing is going to be partially inhabited by initial New Yorkers, but it's also going to be inhabited by people who decide to move to New York from places like Boston or Los Angeles. This migration is going to mitigate local rent increases, but it creates affordability gains in other cities. So because you upzone New York, you're going to have lower rents in Boston. Going back to a point that I made earlier, I find that upzoning is not going to produce the same effects in different neighborhoods. On this graph, I'm showing you the effects of removing zoning on construction in neighborhoods that have different price levels and different existing densities. This is the same data that's projected on a map. I find that zoning is not really going to be binding in areas where prices are low. So if you upzone massively the Bronx in New York, this is not going to have a huge effect on construction because developers don't really have an incentive to invest much in that part of the city. Zoning is not going to be too much of a binding constraint in areas that are already very densely built because it would be very expensive to redevelop these places. Upzoning is going to be most effective in places where prices are high enough but existing density is relatively low. These are the areas in which zoning is going to be a binding constraint and where developers are going to be able to overcome the large cost of demolition. this has a set of consequences for policy. The first one is that if you have limited political capital, you should target upzoning to places in which it would actually make some change. And it turns out that the planners in New York City are already doing some of that targeting. I find that the upzoning that they did put in place were more effective than a random upzoning of a city. It also means that upzoning works in New York, but it's probably not going to have the same effect in places like Detroit or Cincinnati. Good news for Cambridge is that Cambridge has quite high prices, but there are many places in which density is still relatively low, and so we should expect quite larger effects of the upzoning that was just implemented, even though these effects are already going to take decades to materialize. So to conclude, redevelopment is really key to understanding the economics of dense cities. It's a really valuable process because it increases the amount of floor space in these cities and allows for newcomers to come in. It also reallocates land to its most profitable use. But policy change really leads to changes in construction over long periods of time. Even at a 40-year horizon, the take-up of upzoning is quite limited. And upzoning is only going to work in some neighborhoods. Because the gains from zoning take time to materialize and are very geographically spread out, locally, the effects of an upzoning might look small. A local planner might think, okay, I passed this regulation, it didn't lead to a lot of construction over the subsequent 5 years, prices didn't go down that much. It's not because these effects are disappointing that we should not implement these policies, because over the longer run and at the national level, upzoning yields really large gains. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'll be talking about the MBTA community zoning law, and I'm beginning to evaluate the implementation of the MBTA community zoning law. This is a work in progress. I'm working on the report. This is a brand new presentation I made just for you because I'm working on this topic, but the report is not out yet. It'll be a few more months of research. So this is my preliminary thinking on it. What's going on. I'm going to present a case study today about the town of Bedford. Here's the challenge that animates our policy reform efforts. This is stuff we all know. There's been a housing shortage. People have limited choices of homes. Rising prices are straining household budgets. Development patterns aren't so great. The system's bad for social mobility, environment, health, social lives, a lot of other things. In 2019, I did a study of zoning in 100 cities and towns in Greater Boston. Today, I'm going to organize my reflections around the findings of that report. So I'm just going to really quickly go through them. First, little land is zoned for multifamily housing in Greater Boston. You saw that in the zoning atlas. And what is allowed is tightly restricted. So not a lot of height, not a lot of density. Second, the permitting system has been shifting for decades to become more discretionary, less predictable, more time-consuming. So this involves a lot of special permits to build multifamily housing and rezonings that involve votes of city councils or town meetings about individual projects. Time and risk adds cost to development. Third, the biggest trend I found in 2019 in zoning reform at the time was for mixed-use zoning. 83 of the 100 cities and towns that I surveyed had adopted zoning for mixed-use development, retail and residential combined in a single building over the last couple of decades. It was like super popular activity. It's amazing. It's really wonderful that all that reform happened to allow more housing, to allow the mixed use that had been prohibited before. But the issue I came across was that in a lot of places to build multifamily housing, you had to include retail. That just doesn't work in all locations. So that in and of itself is like a barrier to development. fourth finding was that the system was allowing small-scale projects in historic centers and walkable older areas, and bigger projects on the municipal edges, on the peripheries, and not a whole lot of development in the Great Lake residential in between suburbia. 2 years later, the state passed the MBTA community zoning law. It requires cities and towns served by the MBTA to zone an area of reasonable size for multifamily housing as of right near transit when feasible. The state then adopted implementation guidelines and later turned those into regulations. The design of the MBTA communities law addressed my 4 findings. So too little land zone for multifamily, create districts for multifamily. Too much discretion and risk in the system, zone as of right. Only allowing mixed-use projects allows a multifamily without retail required on the first floor. Zoning for car-oriented sprawl, put districts near transit when possible. So that's the design of this state law. The law required municipalities to do their rezoning. It gave them a ton of flexibility in designing the new districts. They had to meet performance measures, but how they met them, where they put the districts was kind of up to them within some constraints. So the performance measured included a certain amount of land area, certain overall average density, and a new concept they invented for this law called zoning capacity. We are actually heard of zoning capacity. Is this something you're familiar with? People who worked on MBTA communities know about it. It's a measure the state created for how many homes could be built on existing properties within a district if those structures were on those properties and they were fully built out to what the zoning allows. So it's kind of this measure of hypothetical development. But we just learned about, like, not everything is going to be redeveloped, especially if it already has some dense building on it. But, like, if it were to be, how much housing could go in. So, has the law worked? And will it work? Is like the big questions. And I don't know, I'm still like working on this. I'm really interested to hear your perspectives to the extent you know about it, what your insights are, what you're thinking. My report's not due out yet. But what we care about the most ultimately is the outcomes, like the new homes that are being built or will be built, and where they're going to be, and what that development will mean for housing choice and for price. Ultimately, time will tell what gets built. But right now, I'm working on this analysis of residential projects that are in the pipeline that are getting permitted under MBTA community zoning, under the new districts. And I'm working backwards from the projects that have been permitted or getting permitted to just get insights about the zoning that was adopted. So the law was adopted in 2021, so like 5 years ago. Cities and towns have been implementing it. It applies to 177 municipalities. They have staggered deadlines for implementation, so some had to come into compliance in 23, some in 24, some by the end of this year. So far, and this is in progress, maybe the numbers changed in the last 2 years, I don't know, 143 have adopted zoning to comply out of 177. Note that to get to 143, this took like a few years, thousands of meetings and hearings and a lot of angst. Millions of dollars in consulting, for planning consultants to help adopt the new zoning. So it's been a huge effort. There are now 17 communities that are officially non-compliant, like they missed their deadlines. And others aren't yet non-compliant. They have votes coming up. There are some that are coming, and some of the non-compliant ones also have votes coming up, so maybe come into compliance a little bit late. That's the big picture. One way I've been thinking about implementation and analyzing it is putting all of these municipalities into categories. So one category is, I'll start on like the top side, the bad side, is the zero actual capacity category. So these are communities that adopted zoning to comply on paper, but not in spirit. So they adopted compliant zoning, but they designed it on purpose so that nothing will be built. So like they found those big apartment buildings that exist and like drew the districts around it, zero actual capacity. Second category is little capacity communities. So they allowed growth, but not a whole lot, just a little bit incremental relative to the size of the community. So I know early in this analysis, it might be that Newton and Brookline are like in that category, although it's possible that either of them will see a lot of growth. We're still like looking into this. I'm on the Newton Planning Board, so we actually have some projects coming through under site plan review through this, but not a lot. The third category is big capacity communities. So I don't know if you've heard about like what happened in Lexington. They have 1,000 units like in the pipeline right now, which is a lot relative to how many houses are there. They wrote new zoning that allowed a lot of new housing at first, but then they rezoned and downzoned after they allowed it. So it's actually like a complicated case, but a lot of projects are still coming through. The fourth category is communities that use existing as-of-right zoning that they already had to comply. And actually, there are not a lot of communities that had enough as-of-right zoning on the books to comply. Actually, Cambridge was one of them. You did like this incredible ups and after, but you actually had enough as-of-right zoning to comply with what you had. And then a couple others like that are Everett and Melrose. And getting down to my notes, but here, I'll just let the fifth category is new capacity, but one-time capacity. So there are some places where there's like a specific parcel that is big enough to meet the performance standards. They rezone to come into compliance, but for like a specific project, you'll see that project develop. And then after that, you're not going to have like capacity for ongoing growth and development. I think it's worth taking note of like how many places is this one time, since like part of the concept of the law was to create like predictable zoning people can use over time to build out. Okay, 23 municipalities so far have projects somewhere in the pipeline from conception to occupancy under the MBTA community zoning. These projects add up to more than 5,000 units. About 1,000 of those are in Lexington, which is our special case. About 700 are in Everett under zoning that was already in place since about 2018, I think. It's a little weird of a time to judge the outcomes of this initiative. It's best, I think, to judge what's going to be built in under the most favorable development conditions. But right now, the costs of materials, labor, and debt are going up. But we're still seeing projects coming through, at least to permitting. So there is activity right now to evaluate. And here's perhaps an overly optimistic case study, a place where zoning was done as the state seemed to have intended it with the law. I don't think that Bedford is typical of municipalities, but it's important for us to see what happens when zoning is reformed in this way. I thought it was an interesting case I'm sharing today. I'm going to present a before and after for Bedford, and I think it illuminates a lot of like zoning themes that I've been thinking about and writing about, talking about. So Bedford has approximately 14,000 residents and approximately 4,700 housing units. Bedford's next to Lexington, Concord, Billerica. I don't have an old zoning map handy for Bedford. This is the 2025 version, but recent changes are pretty small. The big things here to see are that the blue, green, peach, medium pink, lavender are single-family districts. So most of the zoning is single-family only. And then there's Route 3, it's this like line right there. So that's like the highway going through it. And then on the far side of Route 3 is mostly commercial and industrial and some apartments. Here's the satellite view. This is like most suburbs of greater Boston. It's got a historic town center, fine-grained residential around the center. I don't know if you can see that here. And then you've got larger lots, single-family housing further out, and then the highway that I just pointed out with the big industrial, commercial, and apartments on the far side of the highway. Here's actually a slide from my 2019 presentation that I did a roadshow on back in 2019. Bedford was my example. It allowed 7 units right in its center, in the historic center. It created a zoning district for a single property, for a single project, with first floor retail. So the zoning for the single project needed approval from town meeting. Then on the far side of Route 3, Bedford permitted 188 units with required retail also mixed use. The retail actually on the far side of the highway failed because it just wasn't a good place for it and the retail space was left vacant. But the project needed a special permit to go forward. So these examples here just highlight 3 trends from my 2019 report, that there's more building going on in the periphery than in the center, that there's discretionary permitting, either rezoning or special permit, and then the third thing is mixed use requirements like everywhere. Here's a closer look at the 7 units that went in the center. And here are the 188 units permitted under the zoning for industrial mixed use. Also, 2 large 4DP developments went into the area on the far side of the highway. So here's a picture of one of those 4DP developments. 4DP, if you haven't heard of it, is a state law that lets developers bypass local zoning under certain circumstances to build mixed income housing or affordable housing. In 2018, Bedford actually adopted as-of-right zoning for multifamily housing in its central area along parts of Great Road. The planner wrote an email to me in 2019 saying, in a great leap of faith, vertical mixed use is allowed by right. So no special permit for multifamily in certain scenarios, but site plan review is required. And then I went to visit last week, and the same planner showed me a picture of this that got permitted by right on Great Road under that zoning that they adopted in 2019. At that time, they also added another mixed-use district, I think it was by special permit near the Minuteman Bikeway Depot area. And this project was permitted using that zoning, the project in the picture. That's a central location. It's maybe 15 to 20 units. I don't actually recall, but it does also have retail included, and it was required. So that's like the background before MBTA communities. Here's the Bedford MBTA community zoning district inside the pink lines. You can see the fine-grained residential development here. It's like central area, it's walkable, it's a high amenity area, it's transit served. Now, Bedford could have complied with the law, met those performance standards that I mentioned by drawing the districts on the far side of the highway around the 240Bs that I mentioned and around the 188 unit development. That scenario would have been a zero capacity fee for compliance zoning. It would have been legal compliance, it wouldn't have gotten you any new housing, but they didn't go that route. Bedford's planning director explained to me that the Bedford's planning board and their board of selectmen accepted that there's a housing shortage and there's a need for diverse housing in walkable, bikeable, transit-served, amenity-rich areas. So they put their district in the center of town. They believed in it. And I actually know like several of the Bedford activists have been like reaching out to me over years and coming up to me at like hosting parties and stuff. So I know who those people are and they really like care about it. It's like a mission that was personal to them. The district they drew is mostly along the 62 bus routes. And it's also at the end of the Minuteman Bikeway that actually goes to many workplaces in Lexington and in Arlington. And there's another bike trail that goes from that area of the depot to Billerica. Again, my 2019 findings compared to Bedford's reform. Bedford allowed 15 units per acre across 55 acres as of right, standalone residential allowed in the central area of the town. Oh, and so what's the outcome of all of that rezoning? This project is 14 homes that is replacing 2 single-family houses. The developer bought 2 properties that knock on the doors and bought the properties, and that's getting built. This one, the property owners in discussions with the town, thinking about doing like a double duplex of 4 homes to replace that 1 single-family house. This one is a project that's under active review. It's this single family and then the single family next door to it. It adds up to 48 homes that is under review, replacing the 2 single families. The issue here is it's on a floodplain next to a wetland, and so like the engineers are looking at it. It might be limited, but the planner was like excited because he's like, zoning's not holding it back. It should just be a technical review issue with the engineers, and now they're looking at it. So we'll see what happens, but it could be 48 homes. This one's also got, I think, approval. It's like already on its way. It's one historic house, like an 1830s Greek revival. I don't know. It's an 1830s house, but it's getting 2 homes inside that house and then 8 townhomes in the back. So 10 units are going in there. And then this is the 5th project that I saw. It's 2 duplexes replacing a 2-family. The district covers a lot of different types of properties. You can see here they drew it to cover office properties and retail properties. So those are all in the district. And also it covered some residential properties, some single-family homes, some multi-family housing. This brings us back to those categories that I had mentioned, the 5 categories: zero compliance, a little bit, or zero capacity, a little bit of capacity, a lot of capacity. Bedford's definitely not in the zero capacity category. It's also not in the one-time project category, and it's not in the category of using old zoning to comply. They adopted new zoning. Bedford created new zoning with real capacity. With real capacity across multiple properties for predictable build-out over time. Did it adopt a lot of capacity or a little capacity? You know, I'm still thinking about this. It's not an epic amount of growth, but a real contribution to housing choice. I feel like if all communities had accepted the challenge of MBTA communities in this way, it would be really significant progress all across like the region, even though it wouldn't solve the whole like housing shortage and problem. So then the next question is to think through where all 177 communities fall in these categories. I think that's where like the tougher picture comes out, that this has been really a hard effort to get as many people bought into the detox zone as like the people felt in Bedford. And remember, in Bedford, it's only 55 acres. That's kind of like the zoning atlas picture where you were looking at like how much land got changed through the MBTA communities. It's like a really small amount of land. So I don't even see all my minutes here. Anyway, I think that's my presentation. Thank you. Follow me on Instagram. I'm doing a lot of visits to communities, like with all these Bedford pictures are up on my Instagram with commentary. And I'm going to lots of different communities and going to Melrose next week. And you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I post my research and insights there. And then also you can go to the Boston Indicators newsletter or sign up for it through the Boston Indicators website, and also the Accident Update newsletter that comes out sometimes. Or I'll share reports through that. So you can like, this QR code gets you to the signups. But lots of, I'm doing tons of research on this, on ADUs this year, and other stuff about zoning, and working with outside researchers on the local political forum and other permitting issues. So lots of housing and permitting issues. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I do have some questions that I hope we can go over. They're loosely organized by the order of the presentations. John and Jake, I guess the first question I have for you is, was there anything about the zoning atlas findings that did surprise you? I know you said some of it was sort of what you expected, but were there things that stuck out for you? Yeah.
Probably. Hello? Okay. I mean, relating to the MBTA communities or just in general?
I think Massachusetts in general.
Yeah. I would say it was interesting, especially, I live in Cambridge, living in Cambridge and seeing, it's good to visualize everything. I mean, I'm a math person, I like maths, but like seeing how much that multifamily zoning reform changed the map and how it was kind of a simple change. And as Vincent pointed out, zoning isn't everything, but like it's interesting how there's so much red tape and so much regulation that is this kind of single barrier to development and regulation. And there are very simple solutions to just open that gate. And makes me, I'm glad people are focused on this and we're moving in the right direction. I mean, on the other side, I like how our map has been able to quantify how much land has actually changed in MBTA communities. It might not seem like a lot, but then you get down to specific communities and you actually get on the ground like Amy has, and you can see, for yourself walking the streets and seeing how much has changed. So, I don't know if you want to.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's like one statewide finding that stands out, but I do think the thing that did stand out to me, we had this in an old slide deck, and we took it out for this because we were really talking about this particular topic, but we kind of had some slides in the prior presentation we've been comparing Milton and Quincy, like just looking at their multi-family zoning near the transit stops, both of those kind of litigation around MBTA communities. And when you see this, I mean, it's not completely shocking, but it's very stark distinctions in terms of where jurisdictional boundaries are drawn and differences in zoning across those. So that's
Oh yeah, I see it. Does it go down 93?
yeah.
One side versus the other. At the border there. What are some uses that you've already seen of the zoning atlas? You know, whether it's by advocates or researchers or whatnot.
Well, we have started to do a lot of research using our data. You can also go on our website if you want to see a lot of our projects. But John mentioned the statewide reports. We've done one for Colorado, and we're working on one for obviously Massachusetts and Virginia. And one recent project we did was with the Regional Planning Association around New York City, and that was the effect of zoning and shoreline and climate change, and how changing zoning laws will change our relationship to the changing shoreline and sea level rise. And so I like seeing that our data is being used in turn, by people that can explore our map, but also through research with organizations and planning associations, and seeing it it's a good work. And obviously doing the MBTA research will show up in the report.
Yeah, there's also, earlier on the Atlas did a collaboration, Sarah Roden, the director of the Atlas, did with Regional Planning Association of Cape Cod. So kind of diving into what community zoning here.
What were the findings down there?
I don't recall. You're not worked on it,
I didn't work on Cape Cod specifically, but there was a lot of shoreline zoning, and because Cape Cod is very, very beach oriented. So there was a lot of regulations surrounding the environment, and that restricted a lot of housing, and it sort of gave context to what's limiting development in a different way that we might not think in more urban areas. But I think the report is also available.
Yeah, one thing I hear about down there, and also in Greater Boston, is septic versus sewer. So septic's, where your backyard is where your waste is stored, versus sewer where it's going to a treatment plant. Are you able to capture that in the zoning atlas?
I'm not sure the exact details of septic versus sewer, but yeah, I don't know that.
Well, we do code for the housing typologies, but we didn't go into details of how we kind of code for housing typologies: single, two-family, three-family, four-family, and for each of those, there's kind of every kind of range of attributes, setback requirements, height requirements, all of that. But one of them is also whether they're septic or not, and how that might affect the zoning for a particular typology. Yeah, so we've had that.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, because I know that some of the zoning reforms in New England have been focused on places that do have sewer, water, town sewer and water, because those are the ones that are constantly get suited to handle increases in density without having to have a difficult transition from septic to sewer, which I know is one of the things struggling with, because they have very limited sewer and a lot of problems from septic runoff, which it's probably older septic, but still a big problem. And at the end, you mentioned preventing sprawl and climate change. How would you hope to see the zoning atlas used in that regard?
Well, I mentioned the research we did with the Planning Association in Long Island and New York. And when to give another example, I mean, I went to school in Vermont, and a lot of our, it's very interdisciplinary when it comes to the environment up there. And I started on the Vermont team a couple of years ago, and that was the summer when there was that flooding in 2023. And I worked with a few professors in the geography department, and also we had drones, and I would just go out with them and make capture of the flooding. And we just did a little side project to compare it against the floodplain districts and everything, and how much our relationship to how we build in the environment and how much is that's changing with climate disasters is changing. So, I like thinking in that climate-oriented aspect of that, and how zoning has to change to accommodate for that sea level rise, flooding, and natural disasters in general. But floodplain is a big part of that.
Yeah, it seems like such a problem in Vermont, where basically every town was built in a valley, and they now need to figure out a way to reduce their reliance on, having facilities that are very flood prone, creating new places where they can go to less risky locations around.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say in terms of going back to the theme of kind of comparing jurisdictions, being able to see how different jurisdictions that are similar in terms of topography or climate risk zone differently, I think is helpful inform how communities who want to make efforts to adapt or to concentrate development in particular areas that are less prone to climate risk, how other communities are doing it in kind of help inform those discussions.
Are there recommendations you make to improve the EBTA Communities Act based on the findings of the zoning analysis? I feel like I need to put all of you guys in the room, and you could probably work something out.
I mean, I don't want to come off like I know better than the planners and the policymakers. I mean, keep moving in this direction, I guess. I think, like we've said, it's something, but it's also just a start. And I like that it's a larger part of the conversation now. So maybe more housing.
Yeah. Maybe you also have suggestions for improving the MBTA Communities Act based on your analysis of implementation to date by the municipalities? Now that I opened the door to it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how to answer that. MBTA community zoning is like a really hard law to get passed and implemented. This has been years of work. So I said thousands of meetings. There are municipalities that held 60 to 80 public meetings and hearings to get this past the finish line. This was community by community. How many hours were spent on this by municipal planners, by the select board, by the planning boards, by city councilors, by town meeting members, all these different committees, and the school committees were weighing in on it, and the finance committees were weighing in on it, and this was town by town by town. It's so epic, and it took such politics, and then it went to the SJC, the highest court of Massachusetts, to then say if this is even legal, which the court said it was, but how much was spent on lawyers' fees by municipalities, different appeals of it. It's been huge. This was passed in 2021, 5 years later, and we've got some projects coming through, but a major political lift. It's not the kind of thing that you can easily just be oh, we did it, and now let's tweak it here and there, because it's so many people have to go back and adjust it and change the rules. It would be really hard to do, and you can't just be well, we did this, now let's come up with a new set of things that every single community has to adopt. It takes years, even that like stuff where I said 83 communities that adopted mixed-use zoning that was super popular. They started that effort in the 90s. It was like, it took like 25 years of like major advocacy to get 83 communities to adopt mixed-use zoning. You know, like ADUs, like they've been since the 80s, like municipal planners and housing advocates have been working with cities and towns to legalize ADUs. Incredibly slow process, like half of them legalized it. Like most that legalized it were like, it's only relatives of the homeowners or caretakers that live in them. It took the state finally saying, you know what, we're legalizing it statewide everywhere. Cities and towns, you don't have to change your zoning. You can change your zoning to make it consistent with the state law, but if you don't, state law applies, people can add ADUs. At this point, yeah, there are lots of things looking back at MBTA communities. If we could go back 5 years, like how would you design it differently? Maybe you make it a little bit more simple. Like the zoning capacity concept is like really not a lot of people like stuck and like upset in the implementation. There are ways I could think about tweaking it. I don't even know that that conversation is worth it right now. We should like celebrate the successes we got through it. Some of the successes are these actual houses getting developed that like wouldn't have been built before. Some of the success is just that like the whole state has been educated on zoning policy. Like we have incredible capacity and knowledge on this topic before. This is not like elite knowledge now. It's like a lot of people understand zoning. We can like leverage that to the next level. And I think that the next step in zoning reform, I think there are like 4 steps of zoning reform. So the first step is just like you persuading cities and towns to adopt zoning. There are tons of persuasion, and that's like the state paying for housing production plans. Just like mobilize people, think about it, please do it. Second step is incentivize it. Give them money, like say that you're gonna get like grants if you do the zoning reform, but leave it up to them. And we've tried that, not a lot. Like a little bit of zoning reforms happen, but not a lot. Third thing is require cities and towns to change their zoning. That's MBTA communities, and we're requiring it. It's the law. You have to change your zoning. That takes 5 years. It's incredibly hard. So then the fourth step is what we did with ADUs, and we just said as a state, this is really important. It should be legalized statewide. There are a whole bunch of ways that the state can now step in. Like one is the DAB movement, the Yes in God's Backyard. Like the state can say, you can build like dense housing on church properties. Or the state could say, you can build like dense housing around train stations, like as of right, and we're just allowing it. The state, there are all sorts of like different ways the state can like pull back and do it in tailored ways that are thoughtful and well planned, and using the democratic processes of state government to get us permission to build the housing that the state needs without going through this like epic local process that costs millions of dollars, takes years and years, and leads to like really incremental changes.
Yeah, I always think of California because California had a law that's kind of like MBTA communities statewide for a long time, and they kind of wanted something more like Chapter 40B, which we have, that you mentioned, that has so that's not a builder's remedy that allows buildings to stay right, and if certain conditions are not met by the municipality. Here, it's whether you have a certain percentage of subsidized housing, which can be the subsidized housing inventory number is 10%, but technically it could be as low as 2.5% actually affordable housing. Because if you build an affordable building, you get all the units, not just the affordable ones. It's 21%. And I always wonder, you know, if that was actually changed so that only the actually affordable units counted toward the 10%, you know, might that have made a bigger impact than all of MBTA communities as a whole? You know what I can't remember, do you remember what the original estimate for the increase in zone capacity was for MBTA communities?
Oh, how many units?
Yeah, I think it was.
So it's like 280,000 units. But like, if you added up the zoning capacity requirements for every community, that each community was assigned a certain zoning capacity, they had to meet in their like as of right zoning, and the capacity was set as a percent of your existing units, sort of to spread the growth rate evenly across communities, with higher growth rate assigned places with rapid transit, like a slightly lower percentage for if you're on commuter rail, and then a little lower percentage if you're like adjacent to a community that has a train station. So they set those capacities targets up. They added up to 280,000 units, but it was never designed so that you would see 280,000 units because you can build it around, you can put your districts around like existing units, like where you're not going to actually get net units. Like, you know, if you tore down the building and rebuilt it, you're not going to get more units than are already there. So it was never designed that way. Plus, like, we learned in New York State, like, we know that like everything doesn't get built at once or like in 50 years. You know? So that was sort of, but people like sort of grabbed onto that concept early on and were like, this law is giving us 280,000 units. I'm not going to say like how many units this could be to, and it would be different levels of building depending on building or bigger too and other things.
But do you have a sense of the zone capacity based on, you know, the count? Is it zero, basically?
I'm not ready to like say a number, but it's not.
It's less
There's
than half of
no
that,
way
maybe.
with this like fully built out with a strong market that this is more than like one piece of the need. You know, like at best it's like an incremental improvement over what we had before. There's like no scenario where you're just like ending the housing shortage through production in these small districts that were like very neatly defined. Like there just aren't a lot of places like Lexington that like did a really big upzone that could accommodate thousands of units.
Is that something, you said the zoning atlas is looking at MBTA communities? Is the zone capacity something that we're looking into?
We're
Change.
Yeah, we're I'm not going to talk loudly. We're not looking at that per se as kind of first cut, like the zone capacity. I mean, the goal down the road would be to layer the zoning atlas data onto other data to kind of see those things, like to identify like how many of these sites are soft. You can do like at the data from like residentity to look at kind of where there is space available. But even if you had that, residency is yeah. Mass housing partnerships data on kind of like what's actually the built environment. But even if you had that, you know, you identify the soft sites, you still have to do a more sophisticated analysis to see like redevelopment potential, right? So like, you know, even if there's some unused capacity, it's kind of a somewhat meaningless number absent some deeper dive into like the redevelopment of particular sites. So yeah, I mean, I always think like, a lot of like ADU laws that liberalize ADUs, 10% of land gets developed for ADUs in like a couple of years. That's like a huge number. So I feel like with MBTA communities, 10% of that capacity was the additional units built at 23,000. That would probably be like a huge success for the law. That is probably still ambitious. I think, but I think 23,000 would be, and given that like that's like 10th of the governor's like plan for, so it's a very modest approach. I mean, following up on Amy's comments, I mean, I'm someone who's very much in favor of the state creation of local zoning for the most part because it's somewhat controversial, but it's worth noting that like localities only zone because the state grants them the power to zone to preserve the police power, and so. I think if you want to seriously address the housing crisis, that's the way to do it. Which is still democratic. We do elect our state representatives.
Right, and our city councils. That's a few. In the future, would it be possible to extrapolate to other municipalities, or would you need to model those independently in a new study, like what you did with New York?
So I guess one advantage of New York is that it's very diverse. So in New York, you have very dense places like the town. You have places that are almost suburban in nature. You have places that are very affluent, places that are more that are poorer. And this allows to understand the effects of zoning. Just by focusing on New York, you can understand the effects of zoning in various types of neighborhoods. And I think that's one of the reasons for which I chose New York. Then, like, what would be interesting in the next revelation to other places is that different localities use very different zoning instruments. So in New York, it's mostly this restriction on density through SAR limits. But then, different cities have very different zoning rules, and they one thing to take into account is that they often interact. So there are different types of zoning regulations that can or cannot be binding, and sometimes people have relaxed one form of zoning, but it didn't really have an effect because that wasn't the binding constraint. And oftentimes we really have to relax zoning in different ways to actually see construction.
Yeah, and one thing that the research found was that the increase in allowed density or FAR had to be pretty significant. And I wonder, it reminds me of, because in the MBTA Communities Act, the density was not that great, and a lot of times, the required minimum. And in a lot of municipalities, the actual increase over, the existing built environment there was also minimal. So you had very incremental increases. You think from your research you can take that and say similarly that the rate of redevelopment would be quite low, where these gains of zone capacity are very incremental?
I guess it's going to depend on where zoning took place. So if a municipality really didn't want extra housing, one way for them to not get more construction while still abiding by the law would be to upzone in places where they know redevelopment is not going to take place. So for instance, you can allow multifamily housing in an area that's really undesirable, or in an area where there's actually already a lot built, and so even if you allow more housing, developers are not going to come in and demolish what's existing.
One thing I'm thinking about are towns like Brookline and Arlington, where they did want to allow for more housing, but they gave maybe a small gain in density or height in order to do that. And is there a way in the future you think they could be better able to determine whether that will actually increase redevelopment to increase housing, or if it's likely too incremental and will fail to do so even
So in most places, if you upzone and there's actually a desire for housing, over time, various places will get redeveloped. And when that happens, zoning is less restrictive, then the thing that actually gets built will be larger. It's just that some things will only be redeveloped for 20, 30 years, and it's only then where you'll be able to see the effect of that knowledge.
And one thing that I found interesting, people have remarked on, was the impact your study found that upzoning had for lower income renters. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one common reason for which people oppose these policy changes is because they believe that when you upzone, this is going to benefit those of the rich, because these are people who own land or perhaps all of the profit is going to go to developers. It turns out, my study finds that the main beneficiary, you have gains throughout the income distribution, but lower income workers gain more from upzoning. This is for two reasons. The first one is that poor households benefit way more from lower rents than richer households. Or if you're a low income household, you will routinely spend over 14% of your income on rent. And if you're rich, change in housing costs are not going to be as meaningful. The second reason for which lower income households gain more from upzoning is because new construction creates a chain of moves. So if I build more housing in Back Bay, a very desirable neighborhood,
perhaps the new people who are going to live in these new apartments are going to be quite affluent, come from richer parts of the city. But when they move to Back Bay, they're going to make some space wherever they were coming from. Like, perhaps they were coming from Cambridge, and then this leaves a spot in Cambridge that someone from further away can use. And this means that when you build more housing in any neighborhood, this is going to create some vacancies in areas that are where low-income workers need to live, and eventually this benefits them.
And I know you're still working on this project, but I wondered if you've got any thoughts about future research plans?
So what's very clear is that today the main constraint to new construction is not an economic constraint, it's political. If we wanted to have to allow more housing, we would actually get more housing, but many municipalities oppose zoning more liberally, and so it's very important for us to understand why there is so much opposition to reform. The fact that there's opposition means that some people lose from new construction, and so with a colleague, we're trying to think about what exactly these losses are, and like when you build more in an area, who gains, who loses, and why, and are there policies that get put in place that help compensate the losers, such as to make zoning reform more compatible. One difficulty that relates to the discussion we were having about state action is that when you build more in an area, the losers from this additional construction might be like the people just around this new construction event. And the winners are going to be much more geographically scattered. And so as a consequence, the people who might lose have the power to organize locally, have the power to vote, whereas the winners are very scattered. They typically don't have the means to organize, they might not even have the opportunity to vote. So for instance, if you build more housing in San Francisco today, this is beneficial to me because I perhaps have some probability of living in San Francisco, and it will be great for me in the future to benefit from slightly lower prices there. But I don't really have an incentive. I'm very active on trying to promote more housing construction, but the typical person is not going to go fight for more housing in San Francisco because their gain is going to go.
Just for the panel, I guess maybe we'll have to leave it here. Given the timing, I just wanted to talk about allowing multi-family about the zoning, but how important is it in terms of the zoning and trying to actually increase the amount of housing that it be allowed by right? Who wants to take that?
It's incredibly important. I don't understand why we don't allow all housing. I mean, the whole point of zoning is to create a predictable environment for future development, but it's not predictable if everything goes through a discretionary process. So most development should go through, I mean, zoning, to your point earlier, brings everyone to the table within a given jurisdiction that has the authority to zone. You then implement the zoning and development should then proceed as right. The variance process, which we use like it's, like we just give them out like they're candy, because we have to, because otherwise we don't develop anything, is supposed to be a safety valve when zoning would essentially kind of amount to a regulatory taking that would require compensation because it's too onerous. But we instead use it as just the default mechanism through which we have the neighbors show up to say what anyone can do with the property. So I think that development as a right is crucial for any municipality, but it's also just like neighbors should want that because that provides them predictability instead of like whoever shows up on a Tuesday deciding what's going to show up next door to them. But that's my
Anyone else have closing thoughts for us before we end? Well, we'll call it thank you. Oh, John.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out and for organizing this and thinking about these issues and working on them. And I really welcome any of your insights after if you have thoughts on the communities or zoning in general. And feel free to contact me too, because it's like you have a lot of insights that I'd love to explore about. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you to CCTV for filming. That will be available soon on their website. And thank you all for attending and for everyone on Zoom. And good night.